Hi, everyone. I hope all remain healthy and safe. Today we have a really great speaker. In fact, I sort of consider him one of our own here at the University of Chicago. Nathan is one of our undergrads, along with kind of a recent crop of really good undergrads, Molly Schnell, Lynn Barrage, Rick Hornbeck, and of course they're joining people like Paul Samuelson and Bob Lucas as our esteemed undergrads. So I'm very proud of what Nathan's been able to do. I think all of you probably know Nathan, and Rob will give a more formal introduction, but it'd be super hard to find someone at such a young age who has had more impact on the economic profession than Nathan. When I became chair, he was a prime target of mine to try to recruit back, and it ended up being, of course, very difficult. As you can imagine, Harvard fought very hard and they kept him. But I've always been a huge fan of Nathan's work. He sort of works at this interesting nexus of public and equality and opportunity. And he's trying to use economics to change the world. And he certainly has. So I want to say, Nathan, thanks for coming along here on our side. Thanks for joining us. Nathan is joined today by Sarah, Peter, and Christopher, and they will be taking on your questions behind the scenes. And while we're moving along, Rob and I will ask and slow Nathan down at different points when you have questions yourselves. So I'm going to say, welcome, Nathan. I'm going to turn over to Robert to give a formal introduction.
Cool. Thank you so much. Delighted.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Nathan, for being here. Nathan is the professor of economics at Harvard University. He's also the founder and co-director of the Opportunity Insights Center at Harvard as well. As John was mentioning, Nathan's work is on the intersection of thinking about how do markets provide opportunity, but also equal opportunity, and thinking about the sort of efficiency equity trade-off. And he's doing that by using field experiments. So today we'll hear about sort of one of the major field experiments he's been doing with his colleagues to try to understand moves to opportunity in the US. So Nathan, thank you much for joining, and over to you.
All right, well, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's truly a delight to be here, and thank you for your kind words. I'm really looking forward to giving the talk here. So I'm going to talk about creating moves to opportunity, experimental evidence on barriers to neighborhood choice. This is joint work with Peter Bergman, Raj Chetty, Stephanie DeLuca, Larry Katz, and Christopher Palmer. We also want to give a special thanks to our partners who helped implement this experiment, the Seattle Housing Authority, King County Housing Authority, MDRC, and J-PAL North America. Today we have both Peter Bergman and Christopher Palmer joining us, along with Sarah Oppenheimer, who at the time was a member of the King County Housing Authority, helped us implement the experiment on the ground, and has now joined us at Opportunity Insights and is helping with some of the CMTO expansion work that I'll talk about at the end. She's really been a leader on a lot of these different fronts, and I'm excited to have her joining us as well. So without further ado, I want to motivate what I want to talk about today with 3 facts on children and neighborhoods. The first fact is that children's prospects for upward income mobility vary substantially depending on the neighborhoods in which those children grow up. And so to illustrate this, this is a snapshot from the Opportunity Atlas that we created, zoomed in here to Seattle to show the geography of upward mobility in the Seattle and King County area. And what you're looking at is the average incomes at age 35 for children who grew up in these different census tracts in Seattle to parents earning about $27,000 a year, or at about the 25th percentile of the income distribution. And what you can see is a wide variation in the incomes of those kids who started out at the same parental income level, but when they became adults, they had very different incomes on average. So kids who grew up in, say, the North Queen Anne neighborhood, Normandy Park, parts of Bellevue or Kirkland tended to have incomes in the range of $40,000 to $50,000 a year. In contrast, kids who grew up in the Central District, parts of the southern parts of Seattle and South County tended to have incomes between $20,000 and $30,000 a year. And so there's large variations in the incomes of kids who grew up in these different neighborhoods. Now, those incomes are for kids who grew up in those neighborhoods in the 2000s. Our work has also established that over time, it looks like about 90% of this variation remains after a 10-year interval. And so we see these persistent differences in upward mobility across these different neighborhoods that suggest there's just large disparities based on where you grew up that persist to today. The second fact that we want to motivate this talk with is that moving to more upwardly mobile neighborhoods earlier in childhood improves children's outcomes, increases their earnings and other outcomes significantly in adulthood. And so we've established this fact in another piece of work in the United States, looking at moves across different census tracts, commuting zones, and counties in the United States. That's shown in the upper left. And what our work suggests is that the earlier a child moves to a neighborhood with higher rates of upward mobility, the higher their outcomes are in adulthood, to the point where about 2/3 of the variation on that map looks like it reflects the causal effect of cumulative childhood exposure to those different areas, as opposed to, say, a selection component of, say, different types of people living in different places. Now, this design has been replicated and pressure tested across a wide range of different settings in the course of the last few years. So this pattern looks like it holds not just within the United States. You see similar patterns in Australia, in Canada, Denmark. You see similar patterns with other sources of variation in the United States. So using experimental moves based on the Moving to Opportunity experiment and also Chicago public housing demolitions in the work by Eric Chin. And what this all seems to suggest, the way I like to summarize it, is that we look like a weighted average of where we grew up, with the weights proportional to the exposure time we had to different neighborhoods during our childhood. And so this raises then the third motivating fact that will largely form the motivation for the experiment that I'll talk about today, which is that low-income families who receive housing vouchers predominantly live in neighborhoods that have lower rates of upward mobility. And so this is something that could be illustrated in any city across the United States. Here I'll illustrate it in the Seattle-King County area with green dots here that point to the 25 most common voucher tracts where voucher holders with children leased up prior to the experiment that we ran up in Seattle. And you can see that they're spread out across different parts of the city, but tend to be concentrated in areas that have lower rates of upward mobility. Now, there's of course a wide range of potential explanations for this. Perhaps the first that might come to your mind is that it might be more expensive to move to a neighborhood that has higher rates of upward mobility. And on average, that's true. So this is showing you the relationship between median rents for a 2-bedroom apartment on the horizontal axis and the rates of upward mobility on the vertical axis. And you can see that there is a bit of an upward slope. And here we've got the darker dots there are the places with the most common locations for voucher holders. But you can see lots of variation along the vertical axis. And so a place like Woodinville or Newport is just as expensive as some of the places where voucher holders currently reside, but look like they have much higher rates of upward mobility. And so this is going to be kind of the motivation for the core question we wanted to consider today, which is why don't low-income families, quote unquote, move to opportunity, move to places that look like they would have a causal effect on the incomes of their children and other outcomes in adulthood. And broadly, you can think of two classes of explanations. The first class, which loosely I'm going to refer to as preferences, which is that families may prefer to live in neighborhoods that have lower upward income mobility, not necessarily because they don't like upward mobility, but because there's other characteristics of that neighborhood. So Woodinville is a bit out in the suburbs, and maybe that just has a longer commute for them to get into work. And so maybe that just wouldn't work for their lives. Or maybe just has proximity to family in certain places that they like to live that generate these preferences. The other class of explanations you could imagine are barriers, which is that families may be unable to find housing in high opportunity areas, maybe because they lack the information about those neighborhoods. There might be search frictions that prevent them from being able to find a place in those areas. Or you might imagine what might be generously called landlord's tastes that prevents them from finding a unit in an area that has higher rates of upward mobility. And if barriers are what is driving the segregation of voucher holders, it raises the policy question of whether we can reduce those through changes in affordable housing policy. And so that led us to run the Creating Moves to Opportunity experiment in Seattle and King County. This was a randomized trial aimed to develop and test policy scalable strategies to reduce barriers that housing choice voucher recipients face in moving to high opportunity areas. We're going to evaluate the impacts of this RCT using both quantitative and a qualitative set of mixed methods analyses to try to understand some of the mechanisms, explaining some of the patterns that we'll talk through. And that'll be the focus of the talks today. So just to give you an outline, I'm going to begin by discussing the program and the experimental design. We'll then talk through the treatment effect estimates. We'll then talk through the mechanisms, looking through the qualitative work that we've done, and I'll also provide some hot off the press preliminary results from a phase 2 of the experiment that is just finishing up in the field. And then I'll conclude. So by way of background, the Housing Choice Voucher Program serves about 2.2 million families in the United States.
Nathan?
Yeah, by all means.
A quick question from Joel Levine. And he asks, do you have any insights or speculation into the mechanisms responsible for why living in certain neighborhood or neighborhoods affects upward mobility? And beyond the theory or speculation, what is the empirical evidence to support those mechanisms?
Great. So we do not, so I think an active area of ongoing work, which is not going to be the focus of what I'll be able to talk about today, is why do some neighborhoods have higher rates of upward mobility than other neighborhoods, and why do they have higher causal effects? That is, I think, one of the core questions. You know, what's the special sauce, so to speak, that promotes upward mobility? I think we don't know what the core components are. In our other work, you know, you can regress the causal effect of a given place on a vector of characteristics. And you find things like, you know, better school quality, lower rates of lower segregation, other types of factors that you might think of correlate with neighborhoods that have high causal effects. But that's not an experimental variation in those variables to understand what's the causal effect of those mechanisms. And so that, I think, is really ongoing work. I think, you know, my favorite paper in this vein is Laura Durancourt's job market paper, who uses our causal effect estimates sort of on the left-hand side and looks at the impact of the Great Migration on institutional structures and destination locations, and finds long-run effects on the causal effects of neighborhoods today for places that received a larger fraction of Black migrants in the past, and shows in the interim it also led to increases in police expenditure and expansion, kind of a white flight into suburban areas that led to lower rates of upward mobility in those city centers. So I think we're ongoing work to try to understand and unpack some of those mechanisms, but I'd be hard pressed to say that we have any really solid clue on what exactly is driving those patterns.
Okay, good. I appreciate your honesty.
I mean, I think it's an area where I think it's really important directions for future work. And I think to study that, I think our hope is that you have the causal estimates and measures of upward mobility that you can put on the left-hand side of a regression. And so if you have experimental variation that you're interested in putting on the right-hand side, our hope is that the data is there, and that we'd be happy to be supportive along the way. Okay, so coming back to the voucher program, serves 2.2 million families in the United States each year. These are administered by local housing authorities. So what does that mean in the context of Seattle and King County? There's the Seattle Housing Authority and there's the King County Housing Authority. That might sound funny because Seattle is inside of King County, but what's going on there is Seattle has jurisdiction over the Seattle city proper. King County has jurisdiction in the surrounding parts of the county. And that's a common kind of feature of the way housing authorities work. The typical feature of a voucher is that there's an income cutoff for eligibility, often around 30% of the median income. And so if you have incomes below that, you're eligible to apply for a voucher. You do not have a right to a voucher, however. There's a wait list. You can put yourself on the wait list, but you have no guarantee of when and if you'll get off that wait list. Typically, the waits can be about 2 years or longer. Once you get off the wait list, you have a limited time period where you have this voucher in hand and you can try to go find a place. You typically have up to about 4 months in order to do that, after which the voucher would expire and you would lose the ability to use that voucher to find a place. Now, the way the voucher works is that it subsidizes your rental payments. The requirement is that you contribute 30% of your income to rent and utilities. The voucher picks up the rest. Now, the program caps the total amount of rent that can be paid to the landlord, which they call fair market rent. which is determined either at a uniform level across the city, or it can be gradiated based on the local housing prices of the area. I'll return to that a little bit later in the talk. And then lastly, there's an inspection process for landlords along the way. So in order to actually use the voucher, they have to pass an inspection. Okay. What we're going to do is think of an experiment that tries to help families access areas that have higher rates of upward mobility, areas that we're going to call opportunity areas. And so to do this, we have to define what neighborhoods constitute as opportunity areas. And the way we did this is we started with census tracts that have rates of upward income mobility roughly in the top third of the distribution within Seattle and within King County. We then adjusted the definitions in an iterative collaborative process with the housing authorities to account for two issues that people were concerned with. The first issue has to deal with neighborhood change. So as I mentioned, the Opportunity Atlas constructs measures of upward mobility for kids who were growing up in those areas in the 2000s. You might wonder to what extent are those neighborhoods different today? Now, I said that at 10-year intervals, we think about 90% of that variation remains, but you might be worried about particular areas, especially in a city like Seattle that's gentrifying. And so what we did is we collaborated with folks on the ground there to get school district data and look at test scores of, say, third graders, and mapped out their changes in test scores across these neighborhoods, because you can get that for younger cohorts. And what you did see is that in neighborhoods that were gentrifying, you would see increases in test scores in those areas. But what was kind of interesting is that we tended to see a flatter pattern when restricting to test scores of kids who are on the free and reduced price lunch system. In other words, people, once you conditioned on incomes of those kids, it looked like the test scores were actually quite flat. And so we were seeing evidence of kind of neighborhood change in the areas, but it didn't look yet like it was leading to any changes that were significant enough to try to lead us to change the definitions of opportunity areas based upon that. And so through that discussion, we ended up not making significant adjustments due to neighborhood change in the context of the Seattle and King County area. But we are certainly amenable to the idea that this is something that should be on the minds of anybody who is looking to conduct experiments like this in the future. The second thing we were concerned with is that we didn't want to have a big Swiss cheese of opportunity areas. And so there was a little bit of work to create contiguous areas that helped with ease implementation. And so this was about kind of making calls along the margin of kind of what was in, what was out to help create some contiguous areas. And so what we ended up with were the shaded blue areas in the following map. These constituted the high opportunity areas. You can see them both within Seattle, inside the Seattle city boundary area, and also in the rest of King County. And you can see they scatter across a wide portion of the city, but tend to exclude areas in the southern parts of Seattle and in southern county, like Des Moines and Kent. Okay, so that's the definition of opportunity areas. So what was the actual intervention that we designed? Well, the intervention had three key elements. The first element was that we provided customized search assistance to the families. So this involved providing high opportunity area education to increase families' knowledge about high opportunity areas. The second was a rental application coaching process to help increase families' competitiveness for rental units by addressing issues on their credit history, maybe past eviction, to help them prepare a narrative to a potential landlord to help explain, what is going on in their past and why they would be a good tenant for that unit. The last piece of this is housing locator services. So in the process of searching, helping families identify units in high opportunity areas. So if you want to have some loose analogy on your mind, you can kind of think of this as like a realtor service that we would imagine interacting with if we were looking through houses. On average, this nonprofit staff spent about 6 hours with each household. So it was quite an intensive process relative to a lot of types of interventions of these forms. It was a fairly high intensity thing. The second component is increased landlord engagement. And so those same folks who were helping with the locator services were also cultivating relationships with landlords in these designated high opportunity areas to help create housing opportunities for CMTO families. They also worked to help expedite the lease-up process by completing the paperwork, helping with the inspection process, kind of helping the landlord navigate the housing authority environment. And then lastly, for landlords who are maybe worried that a voucher holder might, say, damage their apartment, they provided an insurance fund to help mitigate any risk. In a sense, we vouched for the voucher holders and picked up the bill if there was damage that was done to any of the units. And so on net, we think this actually had a decently strong component to the experiment that I'll show you the results in a second, but 47% of rentals in the high opportunity areas were made through links established by the nonprofit staff. So a non-trivial fraction was involved on the landlord side as well. And lastly, short-term financial assistance. So a little money to grease the wheel, so to speak. These are grants to defray move-in expenses, application fees, security deposits. On average, this constituted about $1,000 per family to cover these expenses. And so when you sum up the total cost of the time from the nonprofits combined with the average financial assistance, it sums up to about $2,700 per family that was issued a voucher, which is a pretty significant cost when you think about an upfront cost of an intervention like this. It's a smaller fraction if you think about it relative to the total size of the voucher, the value of the voucher that those families are receiving. There it's about 2.2% of the 7-year value of that, average 7-year value of that voucher. And so that's the structure or the elements in the intervention. The last thing I want to mention that was absolutely crucial as part of the CMTO intervention is that in contrast to the moving to opportunity experiment, where the moving to opportunity experiment required families to move to neighborhoods with less than 10% poverty rates in order to be able to use their voucher, in this experiment, we did not prevent families from moving to any area that was not a high opportunity area. The voucher still had the same capability to be used in any of the neighborhoods it otherwise would have been without the CMTO intervention. We never required families to use those vouchers in a high opportunity area. It's just the addition of these additional services that help expand the knowledge base and the search capabilities in these higher opportunity areas.
Nathan, just a quick question. Nathan, sorry, just a quick question on that slide. Obviously, there's those 3 key elements. What was sort of going in the background as to why those 3 were chosen? Because you can imagine each of these elements are interested on their own, right? And they could work without a voucher. So could you tell us a bit more about like how this developed into the 3 and why you chose to just lump it all together rather than testing it separately?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm quite glad. I see Sarah smiling because Sarah and I actually, at the beginning of this, so Sarah worked at the King County Housing Authority, and the evolution of this, actually Christopher as well. We all went up to, so Christopher and I went up to Seattle to chat with folks at the housing authorities there. And we said, okay, let's talk about kind of the constraints families might be facing to move to higher opportunity areas. And, you know, I think my prior walking into that, that meeting was, hey, you know, I bet this is really like, it has to be a financial barrier. Like I'm an economist, like this has got to be something that's got to be on the financial side. I think when we got there, it's like, oh, well, the folks on the housing authority staff said, I don't think that's actually what's going on here. I think really this is more of a much more complex, unique constraint that each family is facing that you're going to have to hit differently with different families. And so we ended up designing an experiment that was trying to hit all of the different touch points that families might kind of fall off the train in the context of search. And so this was really designed with kind of that lens. And maybe if there's time at the end, we can talk more about kind of the history of the development on this. But really, it was an iterative process with the folks at the Housing Authority to really think through what the most effective intervention was. And as we come to phase 2, I think you're raising a really important question, which is, of these mechanisms, of these components, which one was important? And we'll come back to a little bit of that towards the end.
Great, thanks, Nathan.
All right. So how did this actually work on the ground? So you can think of the general process of how a family interacts with the housing authority on the following timeline. You come off the wait list and you're contacted. You then, a little bit later, you get your voucher. You can then go search and you eventually hopefully select a unit. You get that approved and you eventually sign a lease. So how does CMTO fit in with this? Well, there's an initial intake appointment where after you're contacted, you're brought in to consent to randomization and being part of the study. And then prior to when the voucher is issued, you meet with the nonprofit staff where you get rental application coaching. They look through your credit history, et cetera. They tell you about the opportunity areas. You visit maybe some of those locations. Then when you get the voucher, you're paired with a housing locator that helps you search in those areas, maybe sends you some text messages with some units that you might be interested in, and really helps with that kind of search process. Then once you select a unit, folks help with the application process. They help the landlords get through the inspection process. They might provide financial assistance with the deposit if that's really what the hurdle is at this point in the lease-up process. And so that's sort of the last touch point of the experiment. Okay, so who was involved in the experiment? What are the families that were brought in? It's anybody who's eligible if you had a child below the age of 15. And so they ran then from April 2018 to April 2019 for the first phase of the experiment. And we had 430 families in this experiment, split randomly into control and treatment. So the control group just got everything that you normally would get if you were to come into the housing authority, just minus the components that I was walking through in the previous slide. And so this led to 222 treatment families and 208 control families. We also, for the qualitative component, sampled 202 families for open-ended qualitative interviews. Here, we oversampled treatment families, 149 treatment families, and got an 80% overall response rate in the qualitative component when I show you some of those results a little later on. Okay, so I'm told when you run a randomized control trial, you have to prove to people that you ran a randomized control trial. So here is a balance table with a p-value of 0.2, so thank you. Now, in all seriousness, this hopefully tells you a little bit of the characteristics of our sample. You have household incomes of about $20,000 a year. Half of the population is Black, 80% has just a high school graduation. The average age is about 35. The kids in the sample are on average about age 6 or 7. About 13% are homeless, 56% currently working, half are satisfied with their current neighborhood, and only about 15% are unsatisfied with their kids' school. Okay, so that's the characteristics of the experimental design, the characteristics of the sample. Let me now walk you through what we find in the results. So we see in the control group that about 15% of families moved to high opportunity, leased up in high opportunity areas, which is actually statistically indistinguishable from the historical mean of 11.6%. And that contrasts with 53% in the treatment group of people who moved to higher opportunity areas. Now this reflects the combination of both actually leasing up with the voucher and choosing to lease up in a high opportunity area. And so you might imagine with all these additional services, maybe we also just increase the fraction of families who leased up anywhere. It turns out that's not true. We actually see similar rates of families who just used the voucher in both the treatment and control group. So 86% in the control group, 87% in the treatment group. The difference isn't statistically distinguishable. Most of these families were using the voucher in both the treatment and the control group. What really changed was where families used that voucher conditional on leasing up. So this is now just conditioning on the endogenous lease up and showing you the rates of moving to a higher opportunity area. That's 17% in the control group and 60% in the treatment group. Okay, where did these families move? This is a little bit of a plot to show you visually where on this map the families chose to lease up or ended up leasing up. The green are the treatment families, the red are control families. And the thing that we take away from this is that they're scattered really across all of Seattle and King County. People aren't concentrating into one particular area of the opportunity areas. It's really almost a uniform distribution across those treatment areas. Across the opportunity areas. We can also look at the effects and how they vary by race and ethnicity. Here, we don't find any statistically significant differences across different races and ethnicities in the fraction of families that move to opportunity areas. The point estimates are slightly smaller for Black and non-Hispanic at a difference of 36% versus 42 percentage points. But these are not statistically distinguishable. And really, when we slice this by different demographic groups, we see pretty significant persistent effects across these different groups, even within these different categories. We also might be interested in what are people maybe trading off when they move to higher opportunity areas. So a couple of things that we can take a look at here is how far did families move relative to where they started out when they first came to the housing authority. The first thing to note is that many families are actually moving quite far to begin with when they get a voucher. So in the control group, on average, people are moving about 10 miles. In the treatment group, they end up moving maybe slightly farther, out to 11 miles, but it's not statistically distinguishable. So that's actually quite similar. And then on the unit size, we find similar unit size characteristics in the treatment and the control group. And so it doesn't look like they're trading off anything significantly on the distance and the unit size dimension. At the end of the day, we might really be interested in the extent to which these families like their new neighborhood. And so there's a lot of ways we could think about that. And I think in the long run, we'll really want to tease this out over the years to come. But we can ask so far to what extent are treatment group families staying in these opportunity areas? Are they satisfied with those neighborhoods? Are they more likely to anticipate moving, et cetera? And so what we can do so far, so the experiment is fairly new, so we can't look at persistence for the entirety of the sample, but we can restrict to the early cohorts in the sample back that leased up prior to January 7th, 2019, where now we're able to see them today more than a year later. So their 1-year lease ended and they now had to decide, do I stay in this location or do I go somewhere else? And what you can see is when you restricted this sample, you see that 19% in the control group moved to opportunity areas and 64% in the treatment group moved to opportunity areas. 60% of them are still in opportunity areas today. And so we still see a fairly persistent effect over time. Another way to see this is to ask what fraction of people in the treatment and control groups stay in their unit over time, and you see very similar stay rates when their lease comes up. And so it doesn't look like there's maybe a worse match in the treatment group relative to the control group. It all looks pretty similar. And then when you actually ask families 6 months after they interacted with the housing authority, so the whole process is a bit long gone 6 months later, they're contacted again by the qualitative research team, and they report higher rates of satisfaction in the new neighborhood for the treatment group relative to the control group, and they report more certainty about wanting to stay in that new neighborhood. So in contrast to maybe a storyline that maybe people were steered by these navigators into places that they wouldn't have otherwise wanted to be in, if anything, it looks like it goes the other way, and these families are reporting higher levels of satisfaction with the neighborhoods that they currently reside. Okay, so why might we be seeing these types of patterns? So to understand the mechanisms, we took 2 approaches. The first was a qualitative study of 161 families that was led by Stephanie DeLuca from Johns Hopkins on our team. And the second is a phase 2 randomized controlled trial with 3 treatment arms that is nearly finished. And I'll show you results that I want to just emphasize at the outset. The numbers will change. They are hot off the press, and we are still getting the final numbers in from the experiment, but thought it was useful to shed some light on some of these important questions. So to start off with the qualitative work, want to show a picture. So Stephanie DeLuca is there in the back, and that's her team from Johns Hopkins University that flew out to Seattle in the wonderful days of pre-COVID, where you could actually do in-person, long-run qualitative interviews in people's houses, which is almost unthinkable today. But we are incredibly grateful to that team that shed some really interesting light on what was actually going on. They interviewed, as I said, 161 families for 2 hours apiece or so, both during the search process and then 6 months later. Generated about 8,000 pages of transcripts. And the way Stephanie does this with her research is you take responses to open-ended questions, like tell me about CMTO, or tell me what was the most impactful part of CMTO for you. And that ends up leading to kind of a string of text that then there's this really long, I shouldn't say painful, but if I was doing the exact coding, I think it's fair to say it's painful work of coding that into classes of things that people say and trying to learn something about what the common mechanisms or common things people are reporting in this process. And so we explored a range of different mechanisms, but really it was 5 things that stood out as being most prevalent. And before I tell you those 5 things, let me tell you the thing that it was not. So in contrast, perhaps to maybe my hope that this was really just about providing information about, hey, these are the neighborhoods that'll help improve your kids' outcomes. That was not what people said. That came out only about 1% of the time. Really what came out was help in the search process. Streamlining the search process was by far the most common thing that people reported. The help of short-term financial assistance to help grease the wheels in places where things get stuck. Communication and emotional support. It can be a roller coaster when going through the process of finding a unit in a tough housing market. Brokering with landlords and providing, being that advocate to help you get that place from that landlord. And then also something that didn't come up in the response to tell me about CMTO, but generally came up throughout the rest of the interviews, is a general kind of increased motivation of moving to opportunity, perhaps kind of a priming of this can be an important thing and a nice thing that you might want to do. So just to put some quotes on some of these mechanisms. So Jackie described kind of her interaction with the navigators as it was this whole flood of relief. It was this whole flood of, I don't know how I'm going to do this, and I don't know what I'm going to do, this isn't working. And yeah, I think it was just the supportive nature of having lots of conversations with Megan. So Megan was her housing locator that helped her through the process of leasing up in a higher opportunity area. Brokering with landlords. So Leah talked about the navigator's role as follows. When you find a place, they said I would come with you and we will help you fill out the application. I'll talk to the landlord. I will help you do a lot of stuff that maybe sometimes will be complicated. And I think that was really a helpful thing from the landlord perspective to have that connection to the housing authorities along the way. Short-term financial assistance. So Jennifer said, I'm not going to be able to pay here and then there in this new apartment. They were able to get me more money so that so that they would pay more of my first portion of my rent because they understood the situation I was in. So what she likely referring to here, she couldn't afford the security deposit, that first upfront rent that had to be paid. In this program, working with a navigator knew that if that money could be provided, this could help move things forward. And so the key lesson that we took away from the qualitative work is that the caseworker's ability to respond to each family's specific needs was really the crucial component beyond just standardization or things that can be easily standardized along the way. And so that's from kind of the key results from the qualitative work. Turning now more to a quantitative approach and kind of the more traditional way we might think about trying to understand a little bit more about mechanisms to do some more randomization. And so we did that too. In the second phase of the experiments, we sought to accomplish a couple goals. The first is really unpacking the mechanisms. But the second is we were also cognizant of the fact that this program was quite expensive. Having a lot of those services is not cheap. And to what extent could we minimize the cost and help scale this more broadly? And so we designed phase 2 to have 3 treatment arms. So phase 1, if you recall, had both the financial assistance components and also the navigator services. We retained that in the first arm of phase 2. But then we also created a financial incentives version plus information version where we retained the access to the financial incentives, so the ability to access security deposit assistance and moving cost assistance in the higher opportunity areas, the education of, hey, here are the high opportunity areas. And so the nice thing here is you've got the combination of information and financial incentives. So there's no kind of, there's a high incentive to learn about, this is in a high opportunity area, this is not, and then this is what I can obtain if I go there. And then the third is sort of taking a bite out of each of these different components to try to reduce some of the costs. So reducing some of the caps on the financial assistance that we offered families, and also increasing the navigator caseloads to reduce some of the time that they're able to spend with each of the families throughout the process. And so hot off the press here, these are the preliminary phase 2 treatment effects for what we see for these different treatment arms. So in the control group, this is plotting the fraction of families who have leased up, who move to an opportunity area. That's 17% in the control group. It's similar in the financial plus information group at 18%, so that's not statistically distinguishable from the control group. We see a slightly higher fraction of people moving to opportunity in the cost optimized support, but lower than the kind of phase 1 treatment, which is holding strong there at about a 60% plus fraction of people moving to opportunity areas. And so what we see with this is that it looks like the financial plus information components are not enough, kind of consistent with I think the priors in the initial discussions we were referring to when we were initially designing some of this experiment, that this was not going to be enough. I think we were able to validate that so far in the phase 2, and also consistent with this idea that it's really this kind of individualized support along the way that's really helpful. And when you start to take that away, you do see a bit of a reduction in the treatment effects. Now, The other thing to mention on these dimensions is that the smaller effects of information provision is consistent with the work of Heather Schwartz and others, and also with Peter Bergman's work, who's looked at the role of providing information like the quality of schools, where you can have effects of providing information on people's behavior. It's just that the size of the effects are much smaller than what you're seeing in the CMTO interventions here. Now, on the financial side, the kind of smaller effect of the financial components is for the cost of moving, not for changing payment standards. And so one other piece of this that you might be interested in from a financial incentives component side is what happens if you change the kind of size of the house or the amount of rent that you can obtain in an opportunity area or in a different area. Now, we were not able to randomize that as part of this study, but what we can leverage is a historical difference in difference design from back in March 2016, where King County switched from a 2-tier to a 5-tier payment standard that effectively increased the size of a unit that a family would be able to obtain in a more expensive area. And so what did this kind of look like? This is a map here with shaded areas in King County, and you can see the increase in the maximum rent that people with vouchers were able to obtain in different areas of the country, of the county. And you can see rents, the rental caps went up a lot in kind of these areas like Bellevue that tend to have higher rates of upward mobility, but can generally be more expensive as well. And so we can look just using a difference in difference, plotting over time in the King County Housing Authority and in the Seattle Housing Authority, the fraction of households who move to high opportunity areas. And so you can maybe think of Seattle as a bit of a control group here, or you can just read this off the time series. These are the fraction of families moving to opportunity areas over time. And you can see that there's not really a significant effect on the fraction of families that move to neighborhoods with higher rates of upward mobility. We can talk about some of the things going on in further detail in the Q&A section, but you do see families moving to more expensive areas. It's just the correlation isn't strong enough between expensive and high opportunity areas where you're not finding as big of an effect. Another way to see this is to imagine if the effect of the 5-tier reform had been as big as what we saw in the CMTO experiment. And there you see in the dashed line what we would have expected if this was just as big as the CMTO experiment. And clearly we can be rejecting those types of patterns. Okay, so just to summarize, the results suggest that there's really little impact of providing the so-called information or financial incentives alone. And we think this is really a story where the geographic segregation of voucher holders is largely driven by barriers in the search process that can be overcome but require customized support in that search process. Optimizing the cost of those services does diminish those effects, so we saw in the phase 2, and our ongoing work is going to try to tease out that trade-off, right? Because there's going to be a trade-off here with how much do these services cost versus what is the quality of the service that's provided. And so just to sum up and conclude, we think this shows that economic segregation in the United States appears to be significantly driven by barriers in the housing search process. And the services to reduce those barriers to moving can increase moves to opportunity and generate potentially significant increases in intergenerational upward income mobility. So just to put some numbers on the potential effect sizes here, the program cost is about $2,600 per family, or about $5,000 per opportunity move. How much is an opportunity move worth in terms of lifetime income for a child in the program? Well, we predict that CMTO, if you had a child that moved to an opportunity area at birth, we would expect their incomes to increase by $214,000. And since I have some time, I'll show you the calculation. So we can first start by looking at the difference, going back to the opportunity atlas of just looking at the difference in the ranks of kids who are in the opportunity areas versus the non-opportunity areas, the difference between the treatment and the control group in the upward mobility of their neighborhoods. We can then take that and translate it into a predicted impact on upward mobility. And so we start with a treatment effect of an impact on 1.6 percentiles. We show in our earlier work that I referenced as kind of motivational fact 2 that about 2/3 of that, or 62% of that, reflects the causal effect of growing up in those areas. Now, about 37.9% of families are induced to move to high opportunity areas by the treatment. And so adjusting for these factors, it suggests that the causal effect from birth is about 2.6 percentiles per child at birth for moving to an opportunity area, which is about $3,000 in annual income. And if you undiscount that and go over the lifetime, that's about $200,000 in a child's lifetime income. Another way to think about that scaling is that you're cutting about 20% of the 25 versus 75 percentile gap in outcomes for people that are at the bottom half of the, born to families at the bottom half versus the top half of the parental income distribution. And so we think from this perspective, there's really a significant kind of impact of providing these services in the long run to those families, in addition to helping these families access neighborhoods that it appears that they would prefer to live in to begin with. In addition to income, income is not necessarily everything. It's also predicted to increase college attendance rates, reduce teen birth rates, reduce incarceration rates significantly as well. And so next steps on our end, in addition to understanding the mechanisms of what drives places to have higher rates of upward mobility, which I think is a really fundamental important question, we're also interested in place-based policies, or trying to reverse the historical disinvestments in places that have lower rates of upward mobility and what can be done on those fronts. Because clearly, not all families may wish to live in neighborhoods that we are calling opportunity neighborhoods. And so we think this is a really important aspect of the research, which unfortunately is not as far along on some dimensions. But I think there's a lot of promising work that can be done on this front as well. And then on the CMTO front, we've been working on a CMTO expansion, partnering with other cities to expand this more nationally, both with the aim of increasing the cost effectiveness, also understanding the mechanisms and the generalizability of these results to other cities. So Sarah Oppenheimer on our team is leading these efforts in Fresno, Dallas, and Pittsburgh, these CMTOX initiatives, to get some RCTs off the ground in those areas as well, to help understand how these effects might differ in different housing markets, different demographic, different institutional structures that could be posing different constraints along the way. And then lastly, we were excited, there was a bill passed like almost a year ago now that provided $28 million in support for mobility services and a demonstration of more mobility services that additional housing authorities across the country are applying for, that we're hopeful will continue to expand the knowledge base of what can be done to expand the opportunities that families face when choosing where to live with their vouchers. So with that, I'm just going to end with a huge thank you that we owe to everybody who was involved on this project, so that the Seattle and King County Housing Authorities, MDRC that helped us implement the experiment, along with J-PAL North America, folks at Opportunity Insights, and the Johns Hopkins fieldwork team. So thanks for listening to me. I'm looking forward to listening to your questions as well.
Excellent, excellent, Nathan. That's great stuff. Let me start with a question that you went into with the causal effects at the end. So as I understand the research area, you have a lot of results based on naturally occurring data, and you can make interpretation from the endogenous sorting of people. And it feels like you go to the causal interpretation when you start to say, if we randomly move people from one place to another, and you're calling that the causal impact, and it's 63 or 64%. I'm just wondering, what data set are you drawing from that is actually truly random? And I'm wondering, if you don't have that data set, how are you able to say with such conviction that it's a structural parameter that you're estimating?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial, and something I just obviously didn't talk about in this talk and took as given. But in earlier work that Raj and I have done, in the first work that I was putting up there, in the second piece of motivational, and then some follow-up work with others as well, I think the core design that we are using is using the universe of income tax and census records linked together to understand what happens when kids move across, when families move across areas when their kids are of different ages. And so the way you can think about that experiment is, imagine starting with that map that I showed you in Seattle, and imagine kids are moving across these different areas during their childhood. And for simplicity, start with families who move once when their kids are in childhood. And what you see is you can regress that child outcome on the outcomes of kids in the origin location, where the kids started, of those who just, let's say, stayed in that destination for their whole life, or the destination and the destination location, the kids who grew up in that destination their whole life. And what you see when you run that pattern is the first kind of evidence of exposure effects, which is the earlier the child moves to that destination, the more impactful, the stronger the correlation as you find with that destination measure of mobility than the origin. And it's actually linearly proportional to the amount of time you spend in each of those two places, or interestingly, the two weights actually end up summing to one. And so it looks like you're a weighted average of those two places in proportion to the amount of time you spend in those two places. Now, obviously that's not random, right? Because it's not random when people move, nor is it necessarily random where people move. And so the core argument we've made in our earlier work is that there's clear evidence that neither of those two is random. It's not random when you move, it is not random where you move, but it looks like the interaction between the two is orthogonal to other potential outcomes. So we're arguing that not when you move nor where you move is random, but the interaction between the two, if you moving to a higher versus lower opportunity area 1 year earlier versus 1 year later is as good as random. That's the argument that we make in the earlier work, and that's how we get to that 62%. Now, what would violate that identification assumption? There's two things that you might be worried about. Dynamic sorting of fixed characteristics. So maybe quote unquote good parents go to good places disproportionately when their kids are young. And so we rule that out primarily through a family fixed effect design. So we introduce family fixed effects into the specification and show that you don't get any attenuation in that fraction of the destination that you pick up in proportion to exposure time. So in other words, if you take two families, one that has a 7th and an 8th grader, another that has a 6th and a 9th grader, and they move to a higher opportunity neighborhood, you can look at the difference in those sibling outcomes. It's going to be 3 times as large as for the 6th versus 9th grader relative to the 7th versus 7th and 8th grade family. And that's going to be proportion, the size is going to be 3 times as large in the 6th versus 9th grader versus the 7th versus 8th grader. And it's going to be proportional to the size of the differences in measures of opportunity in the two places under consideration. And so everything seems to go through kind of within family, if that makes sense. So that rules out sorting on fixed family characteristics. The other thing you might worry about is sorting on dynamic changes in the family characteristics. So you might worry that when a family goes to a neighborhood that has higher rates of upward mobility, there might be something else going on in the household that also changes at that time. And it's that has the time proportional causal effect on the kids' outcomes. So we can rule that out through a couple of different strategies. The first is that the most common things you might worry about are changes in income or changes in, say, the marital status or household structure. So we can introduce controls for that in the tax data that we see quite well for changes in income, changes in marital status interacted with when kids move, and you can see that that coefficient doesn't change at all. The other thing you can do is you can look and use experimental variation in when children actually move. So you can look at the moving to opportunity experiment and look at the treatment effects that we identify using the instrumented version of the move from the moving to opportunity experiment across different sites in the US. And it turns out that using the opportunity atlas, you can predict how big the causal effects were from the moving to opportunity experiment and how different they were across different sites for different demographic groups by lining it up with the opportunity atlas. And so that's another piece of evidence where it sort of all lines up, that it's looking like it's about 2/3 of a causal effect. So there's a lot of kind of underlying work that's sort of behind the scenes in those lines of argument. I'm definitely sympathetic to the idea that, at first blush, you're using endogenous moves. This looks like this is not a very good way to understand causal effects, but it's really an interaction of not moving isn't random. When you move, where you move isn't random. We do argue that the interaction between the two looks like it's plausibly exogenous for these purposes.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. I appreciate the thought. Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, great, Nathan. Thank you so much for that. That was awesome and great timing. There's been quite a lot of questions in thinking about beliefs and the beliefs of these families. And to what extent do you think that the treatments that those 3 mechanisms that you had in the treatment, to what extent do you think they're changing people's beliefs about these neighborhoods, related to Peter's work on changing their beliefs about how the quality of the schools in those areas? And so is there a way that going forward you could be a bit more structured in thinking about those beliefs, or do you think that's just The beliefs are just, what's changing, and that's what's driving the effects of the navigation and the incentives.
Yeah. This project has really forced me to think pretty seriously about what's the difference between beliefs and endogenous utility functions. We kind of think of decisions or P times U, and kind of what do you want to call P and what do you want to call U in that kind of expectation decision function problem. And I honestly, I struggle with this in a lot of ways, and I go back and forth on what I think is the optimal way of thinking about it. I think it's absolutely true that families have different perspectives on kind of how realistic it is for them to think about living in a place that has higher, that is a higher opportunity neighborhood, or a neighborhood that they wouldn't have otherwise have considered. So I want to think of that as sort of a shift in understanding the value of living in those places versus a change in the beliefs over those kind of characteristics. I think that I would lean towards thinking of that as a change in beliefs, but it's different than what you would expect from kind of a standard Bayesian world where, hey, I show you a map and I say, I should go there because now I internalize everything that was in your data set and I'm going to just say, this is great. I think what we realize with the process of the navigator is that the act of understanding takes work, and the act of knowing what these settings that you're not familiar with, if you are not making these types of decisions, they're harder to really understand. And I think that can be a reason that the navigators are so effective in this type of strategy. And the same reason that honestly, when we're looking for housing in a place where you might not be familiar with, you might enjoy chatting with a realtor. And I think the issue is that for people at the bottom of the income distribution, that's not a part of the voucher program.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you.
Nathan, I think rightly so, you've entered now the world of data generation. And I think what you find, and you've probably learned, is that it's a very different world from using naturally occurring data. Because you have questions like, a lot of people are bringing up questions. Rebecca Dizon-Ross has a good question about, why don't you do this one treatment rather than the other one? Because that would allow you to isolate a navigator only treatment, etc. And in your world, you end up having to trade off, in a way, power for information. And as you went through your first experiment, which has roughly 200 in treatment and 200 in control, one arm, you try to get mechanisms from a survey, which, as you rightly point out, is very unusual. Usually this kind of group that you're talking to wants to use randomization rather than survey questions. So then you go to the second part here, and I didn't catch the sample sizes, but I assume they're pretty small because you're still trying to save money and you don't have an unlimited budget. But it feels to me the way you're cutting the data, multiple outcomes, multiple treatments, a lot of heterogeneity, it seems like you're never going to have much power to detect the mechanisms once you take account of multiple hypothesis testing and actually explore the data in, let's say, a modern treatment. So maybe you can give the listeners, the viewers, kind of a sense of the way that you thought about the data generating process, the way you thought about power and using randomization to figure out the designs in this world that you're thinking partly about scaling and partly about testing mechanisms. Maybe you can give the folks some insights about the way you think about this problem.
Absolutely, be delighted to. So I think there's a couple of things. So you're right that what you're staring at here are kind of the standard one-way p-values, or the standard way you would conduct inference without doing a Bonferroni. We'll certainly put in, since we have 4 treatments here, we're happy to put in the Bonferronis on these. I think the broader question you're asking is sort of, what is the trade-off between doing more experiments versus kind of less, and smaller samples versus larger samples? And I think the bigger place where we face this is in constructing measures of upward mobility. And I think that is really an issue surrounding the construction of our mobility statistics and how fine to go at a neighborhood level. And so one thing you could potentially imagine is going down to the individual house level and constructing expected measures of upward mobility. Oh, are you guys able to hear me? I think my video cut out, but are you guys able to hear me okay?
Yeah, you're good, Nathan.
Wonderful, great. And so you could imagine going down to the household level, and obviously the Atlas measures of upward mobility would be incredibly noisy. at that level. And so you always do face exactly this kind of trade-off that you suggest. And I think the way we think about it is you can provide more data to the public by going to a finer level of geography, by deaggregating. And then the question is sort of how do you account for the statistics of that? And I think the way we think about doing that depends on the context. If you're interested in computing a difference between, say, a treatment and a control group, now that just single difference is really just a single comparison. There's no real necessary adjustments for doing multiple comparisons. But you're right, as you start to dive down and you're interested in more and more potential comparisons, or in the extreme, you know, you could have imagined designing this with a statistical lens to, can we rule out that one family might have moved to a neighborhood that has lower versus instead of higher opportunity as a result of us designing the high opportunity areas in this way? And the answer is we can't necessarily for every single pairwise tracked comparison. But when you step back and say, we're trying to provide information to people about the best estimates of what we think areas are that have higher rates of upward mobility, and in that lens, providing more granular data and then perhaps introducing some shrinkage to help provide predictions for people to provide the best kind of posterior estimates can be useful. And so the short answer to your question is that it really depends on the context. Providing more data can expose you to, you know, more statistical uncertainty, but it really just depends on the context and the question at hand. And so I think it all comes back to sort of what exactly is the question you're asking.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. We have time for one more. Why don't you go ahead?
That was you or me?
No, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, sort of moving forward, I think we're all going to be very avid watchers in what you do going forward. And I just would like to know kind of a question that we sort of bring up every week, which is, you know, what would you do differently based on the experimental design in the first or the second wave that you would like to, you know, go back and change if you could, and any insights you would have for junior researchers who would love to get involved and do an experiment like this?
That's a really, really good question. I think, I don't know if it's something that I would necessarily do differently, but I think related to the other questions around having more information, I think understanding more treatment arms, there's always those additional treatment arms that you'd want to run. Is it the landlord side that really matters? Is it the search side of the locator of helping somebody search? Is it the constructing the narrative that families are doing in order to help them interact with the landlord? Is that really what's driving these patterns? I think there's a lot of unpacking that can continue to be done that we have not that we've not been able to do along the way. We kind of took the kitchen sink approach of trying to get at the question of, could we move the needle with providing these services? And I think we were surprised by the size of the effect that we got. And so as a result of that, it's true, we didn't put as much into the isolation of these different mechanisms, mainly because we didn't imagine that we would see effects of this sort. But I think that then opens us into the future and opens up the range of the questions around what is exactly the core constraints, because that's what's going to be needed to understand how we can optimize this and scale it nationally.
Great, thank you.
Very good, very good. So Nathan, just one other quick thought. So I'm a truck driver's son, so I guess I would be low SES. And I was just wondering if people like me move to a high opportunity area, does that eventually, under your model, become a low opportunity area in the future? Is that sort of how you're thinking about it, or is there something magical?
No.
Sometimes I say there's something magical in Cambridge water, that you guys all have these because of the water. But this gets at the mechanism question that we started with. I guess under your model, if it is people, like you seem to be arguing, if a bunch of low quality people like me move to a high opportunity area, I guess by definition that becomes a low opportunity area. Is that right?
So let me just cut you off. No, absolutely not. I think, and this comes back to not wanting to take a stand on what the mechanisms are. I don't think we want to say for 1 second that we have any evidence that this is all kind of, you know, negative peer effects and things of that nature. I think the question you're raising, though, is the fundamental one, which is what is it? It might be that there are different trade-offs associated with kind of having different neighbors, but I don't think we have a sense of what that is, and we're certainly not taking the stand that that's the effect. As you say, it could either be something kind of in the water, it could be something about the peers. I think that's a metaphor for a wide range of different production functions in different localities. I think the key question then is sort of both, what is that instantaneous production function, as you were just kind of highlighting, but I think the broader question here is to what extent do we see historical differences in investments in neighborhoods as a result of large fractions of the population being prevented from exercising their preferences in the housing choice, in their housing choice and housing search. And so I think there's two dimensions of general equilibrium. There's one is kind of the short run general equilibrium of, you know, what happens to the families in the destination location or the people that are left behind, all these really important type questions that can get quite complicated and frankly quite heated in discussions. But then I think there's the longer run general equilibrium question, which is perhaps the idea that housing search can be so difficult leads to underinvestment in certain areas, or makes it easier for places to create neighborhoods that have less investment and kind of not sort of, you know, quote unquote kind of get away with it. I think that's sort of the longer run kind of general equilibrium questions that are on my mind going forward, but certainly don't want to suggest that that we know what exactly is driving the causal effects of these places, and certainly don't want to put that on the backs of any particular set of people.
Yeah, you know, I think you and I talked about this, but in our data down in Chicago Heights, what you find is that we can randomly give you neighbors who are in a treatment, and when parents are in the control and see that their neighbors' kids are getting a treatment, they're more likely to go out and get treatment themselves for their kid. So at least in that way, it's causal, that this is I'm seeing what's happening to other kids in the neighborhood, and I want that for my kid too. So in that way, it's like a top, which was sort of one mechanism that at least we find with our causal variation.
That's really interesting.
I'll stop here and say thanks so much. That was excellent. That was really a great conversation. I really appreciated your presentation. You know, keep up the great work. That's this is just really cool stuff. And Krista,
thanks for having me.
Sarah, thanks so much for joining. And Rob, who do we have next week?
Yeah, so next week we have Rebecca Dizon-Ross from Booth Business School at the University of Chicago, and her talk on incentivizing behavioral change, the role of time preferences. So thank you all for joining today, and thank you all for asking many great questions. Thanks to Chris, Peter, and Sarah for answering those, and thank you, Nathan. That was really awesome stuff. So thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.